Apple's 12-inch MacBook is said to be coming back in less than 2 weeks. They've just sent out the invites for the 4th of March event, and if the rumors are true, then one of the announcements could be the most affordable MacBook ever. That's also powered by an iPhone chip and comes in some beautifully vibrant colors. So here's everything we know, and also why this may be the spiritual successor to the 12-inch MacBook that so many of us loved. So let's start off with what's been pretty much confirmed at this point. And here's the crazy part that raised so many eyebrows when I first talked about it in our previous video 6 months ago. As according to Ming-Chi Kuo, this budget MacBook will be powered by the A18 Pro chip, the same one found in the iPhone 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max. Although this chip is actually quite a bit faster than you may think. It's got a multi-core performance similar to the M1, however, the single core is actually on par with the M3. And given that most tasks usually rely on single-core performance, I do expect this MacBook to be very snappy in everyday use. It would practically be an M3 chip that has slower multi-core performance while also being more efficient. And that just sounds great, because I know quite a few people who are still using their M1 MacBook Air or MacBook Pro, and they're still extremely happy with them. And this will be even more powerful than that in a fun new design, or on that later. Also, the M1 lacked a dedicated hardware AV1 encoder and decoder, which the M3, M4, and A18 Pro all ship with. This is very useful for when editing videos, as AV1 seems to be the new preferred format, especially on YouTube over H.265. And the decoder also helps save battery life when watching YouTube videos, so that's also very welcome. Now, aside from the iPhone chip, the other thing we know that is almost as good as confirmed is that, yes, this is actually happening. That's because back in August, analyst Ming-Chi Kuo and MacRumors spotted a new Apple device identifier in the code, MacBook 17.1, and that was our first solid clue. The 12-inch MacBook from 2017 had the identifier 10.1, so you may wonder, why is this one 17.1 and not something like 11.1 if this is the successor to the 12-inch? Well, that's because every Mac with the M4 chip uses identifiers starting with 16. So 17.1 for the next generation does make perfect sense. And can you guess what identifier the new M5 MacBook Pro uses? Well, it is Mac 17.2. Apple intentionally left out the 17.1 identifier until now, I guess. Speaking of things that are confirmed, Mark Gurman has specifically noted that the budget MacBook will actually be using a premium aluminum build and not a plastic one. This is amazing news, as most laptops at this price point are usually made out of plastic. Even Apple stopped using plastic in their laptops with the 2010 polycarbonate MacBook. Which brings me to the colors. According to Mark Gurman, and also if you take a closer look at the invite, you'll notice that Apple is straight up telling us the colors of these MacBooks: light green, yellow, and blue. You see, Apple likes to use fun and vibrant colors for their entry-level products, such as the base iPad. I think it's because they want to make those products appeal to a broader and perhaps younger audience, such as students that would be interested in a more budget-friendly MacBook. Also, as you can probably tell, we've actually matched all of our MacBook colors and our concepts here with a wallpaper that perfectly suits that color from our app, Wallpapers. We offer the highest quality wallpapers on the market, not even kidding. They're all 8K and 1x1, they're made by humans, and you can use them on your smartphone, tablet, and of course, desktop as well. Links down below. Okay, so these are the things we know almost for sure regarding this new MacBook. The chip, the premium build, the vibrant colors, and the fact that yes, it is actually happening. So now let's talk about what we don't know yet, but is still very likely to happen. First, the design. And I'm thinking that we've got 3 realistic options here. First off, Apple could just reuse the M1 MacBook Air design with the wedge-shaped chassis, since they often do this for budget devices, like the base iPad, or the iPhone SE, or even the iPhone 16e, where they rely on designs that already had R&D invested in them. Option 2, Apple just uses the flat M2 MacBook Air design, but with thicker bezels to make it look more inferior to the current Air. And then option 3, this is what we went with in our concept, and that's a thinner version of the current Air, which would make it the true spiritual successor to the 12-inch MacBook. Personally, I would love option 3, of course. The 12-inch MacBook was one of my favorite Macs ever. It was the thinnest, the lightest, it was so good for everyday use and travel. It was just way ahead of its time because it was held back by the Intel chips. But now, well, we no longer have Intel. Although, if I'm being realistic, I would bet on option 2. The Air is rumored to be getting a redesign around 2027, so it would make sense for Apple to just use that current design, as it would then become out of date fairly soon, and it would automatically make this base MacBook look inferior, something that Apple usually does with their base products. Another thing we're unsure of, but we can guess about, is the display. According to Mark Gurman, it would be just under 13 inches, so technically it would be a 12.9 very likely inch panel, although I think Apple is still going to market it as 13 inches. As for the specs, I'm thinking 400 nits of brightness, just like the M1 MacBook Air, again to set it apart from the current gen Air that sits at 500 nits. Would this matter in real life? Probably not, but this is the exact type of differentiation that Apple usually likes to do, just to create some separation between their products. And then we've got the storage, which I'm thinking it will almost certainly start at 256 gigabytes. Maybe we could see 128, just like the A18 Pro powered iPhone 16 Pro, but honestly, that would likely be way too low, even for a budget laptop nowadays. Plus, Apple hasn't actually shipped a MacBook with 128 gigabytes of storage since 2019, or 2020 if, fun fact, you take a look at the education-only M1 MacBook Air. I mean, even the base iPhone 17 starts at 256 now. But there's a catch. To hit this price point, Apple may need to use a single 256GB NAND chip instead of two 128 modules. We saw exactly this with the M2 MacBook Air, where its storage speeds were actually just around 1500 megabytes per second read and write, or about half of the ones on the M1, M3, and M4 models that did use dual chips. Speaking of gigabytes, this takes us into the third part of this video, and that's the part where we still don't really know anything about, and it's also really hard to guess what Apple would do here. For example, RAM, this is quite a tricky one to guess, as we haven't had any rumors. I'm guessing that Apple could either use 8 gigabytes of RAM to differentiate it from the MacBook Air, or 16. 8 gigs would make a lot of sense because this is what the A18 Pro chip came with inside the iPhone 16 Pro. This would be enough for Apple Intelligence and daily use, especially since macOS is fairly efficient with memory usage and compression. And then Apple would perhaps update that to 16 gigs next year to just make it more appealing again. Although for future-proofing, 8 gigs is definitely not enough, so there's also the option that it could come with 16, which I believe would be the right thing to do, especially since this will ship with macOS Tahoe, which is quite a bit more RAM hungry. But then the A18 Pro doesn't have a version that comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM, only 8. Well, did you guys know that the A12Z, the Apple Silicon Transition Kit Mac Mini, that was actually running on an A-series chip, but it was paired with 16 gigabytes of RAM. So that was the exception, so hopefully Apple does the same with the A18 Pro, and we do get 16 or at least a middle ground, 12 gigs, like we have in the M5 iPad Pro. So what about the port selection? Well, this is another area filled with uncertainty. Since the A18 Pro chip does not have a Thunderbolt controller, it means that it will lack Thunderbolt just like the OG 12-inch MacBook, and probably just use a 10 gigabit per second USB-C port instead. This also means that we'll be limited to just one external display only as opposed to two on the MacBook Air. And as for the number of ports, part of me feels like we'll only get one USB-C in addition to that MagSafe 3 port, which would make it inferior to the Air, and besides the iPad Pro, which is a Pro product, also only has one single port as well. And of course, a headphone jack that may also support high impedance headphones just like all the recent Macs. So what about its naming? Well, how does a MacBook SE sound like? Because some reports have been mentioning this, but honestly I would find it hard to believe that Apple would end up calling it the MacBook SE, especially since they kind of dropped the SE name with the launch of the iPhone 16e. MacBook E also sounds weird, especially since they already have or had a well-established name for a budget MacBook, simply just MacBook. Another thing that's fully uncertain is the battery life. You see, the A18 Pro is actually more power efficient than Apple's M-series chips, which means that on paper, this MacBook could actually outperform the MacBook Air in terms of battery life. Will Apple even let this happen? I don't think so. That's because the Air already sits at 18 hours of video playback. I don't think Apple's going to let a cheaper product outperform their mid-range laptop. So my bet is on a slightly smaller battery, landing somewhere in between 15 to 17 or so hours. Still excellent, just not accidentally better than the product that's above it. So what about pricing? Well, while the M4 MacBook Air officially starts at $999, it's always on sale for $799 to $849 on Amazon. Link down below, by the way, if you want to get a really good deal on the M4 MacBook Air. Also, Walmart has been selling the M1 Air for $649 for a few years now, sometimes as low as $599. This MacBook would of course replace that, especially since Walmart is now out of stock of the M1 version. So my expectation is between $649 to $699. And think about this, the M4 Mac Mini starts at $599 or $509 refurbished. A MacBook that adds a display, a battery, a keyboard, trackpad for $649? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, even with an iPhone chip instead of an M series chip, if Apple gets this right, they could just have the best value Mac they've ever released. Also, Daniel from the future here, as there have been some last-minute leaks on this. First, Tim Cook shared a teaser for what seems to be a full week of Apple launches, starting from this Monday. And that definitely looks like a MacBook lid. And second, a leaker on Weibo leaked a ton of details about his entry-level MacBook, some of which were my guesses too, like a lower screen brightness, lower SSD speeds, and some of which were also new, like no backlit keyboard, no True Tone, and more. So, will this new 12-inch or 13-inch base MacBook powered by Apple Silicon be the one we always wanted? Well, hopefully, but what do you guys think? Let me know down below. I'm personally super excited for this. I think it would become my go-to recommendation for anyone looking to buy a MacBook, especially since performance-wise it should be similar to the M3 for everyday use, but it will of course be much more affordable. But yeah, we'll definitely have hands-on videos as soon as it comes out, so stay tuned to the channel, subscribe for that, check out our app wallpapers for all of these awesome designs. I'm Daniel, this is Enough Tech, and I'll see you guys in the next one. So Enough Tech, signing out. Cheers.